The state of Maine has 2,400 islands that are at least an acre in size, scattered across nearly 3,500 miles of coastline. That's more islands than the entire rest of the east coast of the United States. These rugged coastal islands are the crown jewels of Maine's jagged granite shoreline, isolated places where generations of families have carved out a living from the ocean and the land. Maine also has significant numbers of historic islands on our lakes and rivers, most notably Fry Island on Sebago Lake and Swan Island on the Kennebec River. Swan Island is actually comprised of two islands, the larger island and a second smaller island known as Little Swan Island. Swan Island is often confused with Swans Island off the coast of Acadia National Park, but they are distinctly different places. Swan Island is located at the head of Merry Meeting Bay, 20 miles up the Kennebec River from Fort Popham in the coastal town of Phippsburg, and 10 miles north of Bath Iron Works, Maine's largest employer. Swan Island rests between the central Maine towns of Dresden and Richmond. The island measures 4 miles long and is comprised of 900 acres of forest and 400 acres of fields. Swan Island is unusual in part because of the rare intertidal plants found here. Shoreline grasses located primarily around the southern end of Swan Island were once an important food staple for Native Americans.
The Kennebec River above the chop, so all of Merry Meeting Bay up, is fresh water, yet it's tidal. So when you have a 4.5 to 7 foot tide, you have a lot of water plants that are not found elsewhere. For instance, throughout Merry Meeting Bay, probably the predominant grass is wild rice, and it is edible. The only other place it grows in the United States is in Minnesota. That was a staple for the Native Americans and also for all the migratory waterfowl. But there used to be, in the 1950s, there would be as many as 30,000 ducks on the bay at a time. So you can see why the natives would call Merry Meeting Bay Duck Water Place.
The Kennebec River once served as the major connecting point for all Native Americans living up and down Maine's coast. Merry Meeting Bay was important to Native Americans. The bay is located at the confluence of 6 main rivers, making it a vital transportation corridor for centuries.
Starting about 9,000 years ago, basically the head of Little Swan Island connecting to the Dresden shore was the head of tide. That was the falls. And on the Dresden shore, there was a fishing station from the Middle Archaic period up through, so from 9,000 years ago till 4,500 years ago. That's probably why the Swan Island area is so important to the Native Americans through history. There were several different groups of Native Americans in this area. The Eastern Abenaki were probably for the most part those groups that were found on the Kennebec, and they were known by their primary settlement. So the Kennebec would have been the natives in this part of the flowage. So basically from Swan Island probably up to Augusta would have been the Kennebecs. Then when you got up further upriver above Waterville, Winslow, you'd have the Norridgewocks. But they were all interrelated.
The remains of a stone fortress, possibly a trading or command post, could still be found on Little Swan Island as late as 1897. Archaeological digs have uncovered pottery shards and stone tools on Swan Island going back an estimated 500 to 1,500 years. Prior to the industrialization boom of the 19th century, the river was teeming with shad, sturgeon, and salmon. Historical accounts vary, but some believe Swan Island was named for migrating swans said to have sought refuge here. Others believe the name is short for Sawangan, the Abenaki word for Island of Eagles.
Sawangan is an Abenaki word that they use to describe those two islands. Now the end of that word, Sawangan, the gen denotes tribe or band. So the full name means tribe or band of natives living on the island of Eagles.
Europeans arrived on Swan Island in the 17th century and made several attempts to form a village. They were not, as commonly believed, fleeing religious persecution. Settlers came here to acquire land, enrich themselves, and make money for those who financed their voyages. A group of Boston investors known as the Penobscot Proprietors had their sights set on Swan Island and the surrounding land because they wanted the resources found here, namely timber, fur, and fish.
The proprietors were interested in land, so they got together and pooled their money to buy what they thought was northern Massachusetts. One of the places that had been known since 1607 was the Kennebec River, and that there was an island up there, and it was a rich, fertile island for planting. So they came up the river to go to that island.
Most of the settlers they brought in were Scots-Irish, who were really Scotsmen who had been driven out of Scotland, were living in Northern Ireland, and then came here. They were mostly Presbyterian, they were not Catholic. So Boston didn't know what to do with them, so they shipped those people up here to be on the border between white settlement and the French and Indians. There was a lot of conflicting ownership then, but before anything really happened, we had King Philip's War, the first of the Native American wars with the Native Americans. And at that time, all of Merrymeeting Bay was cleared out, everything down to Bath. In fact, all whites were basically driven down to the Saco area. Then in 1722-23, between 40 and 60 canoe loads of Native Americans came in, burned the houses, killed the cattle, let the women and children walk to Boston, took 5 of the key men up to Canada, let them go, and said, when you walk by Merrymeeting Bay, don't turn and look behind you because you're not going to be back here again. But at that time, they left people in a fortified garrison house on Swan Island, and also Fort Richmond. The beginnings were just on the Richmond shore at the head of the island.
Tensions and hostilities between Maine's native population and the colonists exploded into open warfare before, during, and after King Philip's War in 1675. Native rights were not respected, and treaties between the Abenaki and English were routinely broken. Native people were alarmed by the increasing numbers of settlers laying claim to their ancestral land and pushed back against this incursion. Raids became so common in the late 1600s and 1700s that Massachusetts agreed to build a protective garrison on the Richmond side of the river. Fort Richmond was constructed on the riverbank overlooking both channels of the Kennebec River. The fort is long gone, but at the time of its construction, the structure boldly demonstrated that the English would continue to promote settlement, ensure safety for the colonists, and satisfy the wishes of the Penobscot proprietors. And the fort's commanding presence helped reassure nervous settlers they'd have protection if they set down roots on or around Swan Island. Attacks on settlers continued well into the 18th century until the native people were overwhelmed by the sheer number of new arrivals. Colonists were intent on acquiring land here, often at great danger to themselves and their families. In 1750, Captain James Whiddon lived on Swan Island with his family, all of whom were later captured and brought unharmed to Canada by Native Americans determined to defend their homeland. Tragically, most Native Americans were eventually forced to move on to Quebec, or they were assimilated into the Penobscot tribes, their lives forever upended by the avarice and greed of European land speculators. The first European settlers to firmly establish themselves on the island came in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Some came simply to claim land for themselves. The level ground and fertile soil on the island provided a solid foundation for growing a wide variety of crops, including corn, oats, and wheat. By 1766, Swan Island had 18 recorded inhabitants, and a colonial village began to take shape. For visitors and historians alike, Swan Island is uniquely fascinating because it represents something almost unheard of in New England. A once thriving town that gradually vanished, an East Coast version of an Old West ghost town. Swan Island was once part of the town of Dresden, but due to a dispute over taxes, the island broke free of the mainland in 1847 and became the independent town of Perkins. Perkins was named after Thomas Perkins, a wealthy Boston philanthropist and summer resident who paid for the town's incorporation.
The residents on Swan Island decided that they wanted to be their own entity. So they pulled back from the governance of Dresden and became their own incorporated town. And the town was named after Thomas Handesed Perkins, who put the money up, and it may have only been $50, but he was the richest guy on the island and had the passion to want that town to begin. So that's what he did.
Thomas Perkins was introduced to Swan Island in the 1820s by his wife Jane. Perkins was instrumental in the establishment of the township, but he was best known for the role he played in the support of the first school for the blind in Boston, Massachusetts, a school attended by Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan, among others. He also played a role in the construction of the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston, and the 4-mile-long road linking the north end of Swan Island to the south is named Perkins Highway in his memory. But Perkins had a darker side. Great wealth and philanthropy often conceal an imperfect past. His fortune was based in part on his active involvement with the opium and slave trades. By the second half of the 19th century, regular ferry service to Richmond had been established, making transportation to and from Dresden and Richmond, and thus the island, much easier. At one time, as many as 20 homes could be found on Swan Island. Today, only 4 of the original 18th and 19th century homes from the old town of Perkins days remain standing on the island, along with one house built in the early 1900s that is used as a caretaker headquarters today. The first stop on your Swan Island tour leads you to the historic Tubbs Reed House, located on the north end of the island. The Tubbs Reed House was built in the Federal style just after 1800 by Major Samuel Tubbs of Berkeley, Massachusetts. Tubbs was commissioned as a major in the Massachusetts militia in 1776.
Samuel Tubbs brought some of his cronies up here to build houses, start sawmills, start grain grinding mills, just to populate the area. And there were conditions on the rental of his properties. He would call somebody up here, pay their moving expenses and give them money and materials to build a house and then rent them the house while they worked for him at the sawmill.
So it was really the forest products, the furs, and the fisheries that were attractive to the whites. And of course, if they could get enough people up here, then you could start selling the land as well. And the Kennebec proprietors, the Pajepska proprietors, the Clark and Lake interests on the Kennebec, they were all out to make money. I mean, they weren't just looking for religious freedom, they were here for business purposes.
It was a pretty harsh delineation between that upper class of proprietors and the people that populated the island initially. And then the proprietors, for example, Sylvester Gardner, built what he said was a cottage for his daughter when she got married, and they lived there for a year or so, and then they loved it so much they came to live and raise a family.
This salt box-style home was built by Sylvester Gardner sometime around 1760, making it one of the oldest summer homes in all of New England. Gardner built the home as a wedding gift for his daughter Rebecca and her husband Philip Dumeric. The couple used the home primarily as a summer residence. Gardner was one of Central Maine's earliest and most prominent colonial investors. He was an influential physician and land developer. Gardner was also known as a British loyalist who fled to Canada during the American Revolution. The Central Maine town that is today known as Gardner was named Gardnerstown Plantation after him in 1754. In later years, the Dumeric family was consumed by tragedy. On September 4th, 1855, Margaret Dumeric, her daughter, and a family friend, Sarah Richards, drowned in the turbulent channel separating Swan Island from Little Swan Island. Hearing the desperate cries of her daughter and her friend, Margaret jumped into the channel to try to save them, and all three women perished. The historic record suggests Swan Island may have played a role in one of the most noteworthy military debacles in New England's colonial history. The Arnold expedition is the best known and most ill-advised journey ever taken up the river. According to legend, during the fall and winter of 1775, Aaron Burr, General Henry Dearborn, and Benedict Arnold were believed to have stopped on Swan Island.
If you read any of the actual journals that were generated by the men in the Arnold expedition in 1775, every single vessel ran aground on the sandbars.
They were on their way to pick up the bateaus that ended up being miserably inadequate, but I cannot imagine with that island right there that they wouldn't have stopped.
Aaron Burr was rumored to have spent the night on the island. From here, Arnold's ill-fated army of soldiers, 1,100 of them at the outset of the journey, paddled bateau riverboats and marched 350 miles north on their infamously disastrous attempt to conquer Quebec. Burr went on to become Thomas Jefferson's vice president, and Benedict Arnold remains one of North America's most controversial political figures. The Arnold expedition was given the romanticized historical fiction treatment in Kenneth Roberts' Arundel, a highly regarded historical fiction novel focused on the gallantry and hubris of the Revolutionary War years in Maine. Roberts memorably described Swan Island as a gem of the Kennebec in a passage of his book.
The lower head of Swan Island, which is an island 4 miles long, points down into Merry Meeting Bay like a broadhead arrow with a broken tip. The front edge of the headland was used as a lookout by the Swan Island Indians, who are Abenakis, very friendly people, and part of the Kennebec tribe.
The Swan Island of the 19th and early 20th centuries gradually developed into a village comprised of resourceful men, women, and children. The island was a tranquil place, but life was challenging here, and the settlers had to work hard to survive.
Perkins Township consisted of a little one-room schoolhouse that had all the grades and one teacher, the boat yard. It had a church, a little chapel.
They did have a school building that they also used for church services and for town meetings. They had a community band, and they were mostly self-sufficient homesteads to the point they could be, with a little job on the side if they could. A little bit of logging, not too much because they had to move the logs by water. There was a brickyard on the island, and that's where most of the bricks for the brick buildings at the foot of Main Street in Richmond came from. Some subsistence farming, a blacksmith, a few other trades.
In 1837, David and Drusilla Reed purchased the Tubbs house. The Reeds and their children resided there into the 1920s, but the house was never plumbed, serviced by electricity, or centrally heated during their time there. David Reed was a farmer who tended, among other things, 18 sheep by the year 1860 and 20 apple trees by the year 1880. The soil on and around Swan Island is some of Maine's finest, and throughout the island's history, farmers could count on bountiful harvests.
You look around Merry Meeting Bay on similar land, and it's some of the best farmland, at least in this part of central Maine, because it's alluvial soil. It's stuff that's come down the river. It's fines, it's good stuff, it drains well.
At its peak, approximately 25 families lived and worked on Swan Island, and the population at one time rose to over 100 people. Farming, fishing, lumbering, shipbuilding, and ice cutting were among the thriving industries typical of the island's early days.
The industries went from several ice houses from various companies that had ice houses up and down the river, but there were four, at least three for sure, but maybe four ice houses on the island. So that was a huge industry. I mean, there was, Kennebec River ice went all over the world.
The ice industry on Swan Island began in the 1830s and strengthened during the Civil War years. The island's ice-cutting business grew well into the 1880s before dying out altogether sometime around World War I. At the peak of ice production, at least 3 large ice houses were active on Swan Island, cutting and exporting ice shipped all over New England to places as far away as the West Indies and New Zealand. Tourism was another major industry here. Swan Island was an unspoiled place of natural beauty and a popular summer retreat for Victorian-era visitors looking to escape from the stresses of city life.
They would come up to get away from the miasmas of the cities, and they would just sit in the country and watch the world go by, the river, the horse carts, whatever it was, the boats.
A health spa craze was underway in the mid-19th century, and Swan Island was once advertised in a Boston-based magazine called Ballew's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion as a natural medicinal cure-all retreat for whatever ailed you.
The Gardner Dumeric House was bought by a Dr. William Hebert, who was going to run a resort, if you will, Swango, where you could get the new eclectic cure.
This curious promotional effort was cut short by the advent of the Civil War. Islanders supported the Civil War by developing a wool clothing production industry to help produce uniforms for Union soldiers. Wool was in high demand throughout the war. In 1864, 500 sheep were brought to the island to support the Union Army cause, and production continued throughout the duration of the war. The Civil War also claimed casualties from Swan Island. Out of an overall island population of just 90, 5 young men from the island served in the 19th Maine Division, and 2 of these men were killed during battle. For a time, shipbuilding was also a source of employment for Swan Island's inhabitants. At least 7 ocean-going vessels were built on the island in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By the early 1900s, a dramatic economic shift away from traditional industries was underway on Swan Island. Iron ships became popular, and the island lost its wooden shipbuilding business. Modern refrigeration rapidly brought an end to the ice-cutting industry. Pollution from industries located upriver resulted in a loss of fishing income. Extensive timber harvesting turned much of the island into barren fields. As the traditional industries began winding down, many island residents were forced to leave in search of other jobs. Agriculture was one of the few remaining sources of income on Swan Island. But as the severe effects of the Great Depression sunk in, farmers here and elsewhere began experiencing extraordinarily difficult times. Many younger residents left the island seeking a better future, and those who remained could no longer make a living from farming. The construction of the Richmond-Dresden Bridge in 1931 was the death knell for the Swan Island community. Islanders could no longer rely on Richmond's ferry service to transport them to and from the mainland, leaving many residents stranded.
And they were able to survive as a town until 1917, so for 70 years. And at that time, there were not enough male voters, 21 years and older, to fulfill all of the required constitutional positions of a town. So they were disorganized, technically is the term, by the state, and they became a township. At that time, the state became the taxing authority, and before long, they had acquired 2 of the parcels on the island for non-payment of taxes. So that was how they sort of got invested in the island.
Various attempts to establish new industries on the island failed during this time. A fox farm and a wooden box production company were unsuccessful. In 1932, investors tried to reestablish a wool production operation on the island. Governor William Tudor Gardiner and his business partners brought 1,500 sheep to Swan Island, and only 75 sheep survived the harsh Maine winter. As the final exodus began, many of the farmsteads were given up in lieu of taxes. The state of Maine took over some properties by eminent domain. Other properties were simply abandoned. After the last residents packed up and left, Swan Island transitioned into a wildlife management area and continues to be overseen and maintained by the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. Maine's Inland Fisheries and Wildlife recognized the island's value as a waterfowl management watch site. Federal aid to wildlife restoration funding enabled the IFW to begin buying the farms on the island in the early 1940s. The transition from an active village farm community to a wildlife preserve called for focused, determined leadership and planning. Steve Powell was one of the earliest biologists living and working on Swan Island. Powell was an influential and enthusiastic steward of the island. He graduated from the University of Maine, Orono in 1940 with a degree in wildlife conservation, and then went on to serve with honor in the Pacific Theater during World War II.
Interesting man. Steve Powell was assigned to Swan Island. He always had a pipe or a cigarette in his mouth. Steve Powell also did quite a bit of trapping, true outdoorsman, quite a fisherman.
He kept meticulous records of banding geese and ducks and the deer, and also they did chemical testing of deer repellents during that time.
This was a perfect experimental island for it because there was a large deer population. It was controlled. They also did some work raising game birds out there, but didn't have a lot of focus on that. He was also a wonderful scientist. He would go out as the migratory waterfowl were coming through and count the number of each species that he would see on the bay on a given day, and he would chart them out, whether the teal or the wood ducks or the Canada geese, whatever. And based on that, they actually set the hunting season so that both the hunters and the ducks were able to benefit. At one point in time, he went out on the bay, I think it was 1954 in October, and he did it by boat, by airplane, by car, and he estimated 1,000 duck hunters in the bay and that they harvested 2,500 birds between them on that one day. He was also interested in where the birds went. So he would do a lot of catch and release banding, and when especially the Canada geese were found with their leg bands in South Carolina or wherever, over time you get a list of 100 of these birds and where they were found, you begin to understand how the inland waterway flyways worked. And this was some of the very earliest work in that respect. They also did a lot of work with deer populations. At one time, they had over 300 deer in the island. They did a lot of catch and release there too. And from that, they determined that about a 10-mile radius, if you took a deer more than 10 miles away from where it started, it probably would not find its way back. But if you took them 6 miles away, they probably would. They also transported deer to many of the islands of Maine. His wife, Polly, I don't think she was 5 feet tall. Steve Powell never had children. He raised Springer Spaniels. They did raise the first male moose ever raised in captivity out there in 48 and 49. Jerry the moose was brought there. His mother was killed when he was hours old by a logging truck up in northern Maine. He was raised there for 2 years. He didn't know he was a moose. Whenever any of the men would come around with cigarettes in their pocket, he would try and flip the cigarette pack out of the pocket because he liked eating tobacco.
Powell and his wife Polly lived on Swan Island from 1945 until 1951. After 6 years of island living, Steve and Polly moved ashore to Greenpoint Farm in nearby Dresden and began growing strawberries and apples.
At that time, Steve purchased the land in Dresden that's now Greenpoint. And he expanded the land. He did some orcharding, he did some berry growing. Greenpoint now is also a wildlife management area, a little separate from Swan Island, but really part of the whole thing. Steve Powell later ended up managing all of the state wildlife management areas in Maine.
Powell died in 1971, and the Steve Powell Wildlife Management Preserve was named in his honor. Federal aid to wildlife restoration funding enabled the IFW to begin buying the farms on the island in the early 1940s. By the early 1950s, the only remaining piece of private land was the Curtis Cemetery. Wildlife, waterfowl, and fish continue to thrive here long after the island was acquired by the state of Maine. Today's Kennebec River is a far cry from the polluted, industrialized waterway of yesterday. Native species like sturgeon have seen their populations come back strong in recent years, and the eagle population has rebounded from a time when they faced near extinction.
Every single one of the anadromous fish, which are fish that return to the river to spawn, I think there are 13 of them, every one of those is found in the Kennebec flowage. And the numbers have greatly increased for a lot of them, especially with the removal of the Edwards Dam in Augusta and then the first dam on the Sebasticook. So the numbers have gone way up. The sturgeon are still pretty strong. When we go out on the Maine Maritime's boat, we often see the sturgeon jumping.
The English that came up the river, that's why they came up the river, for furs and for the fish. And there were sturgeon and there were cod, and it was prolific with huge fish. They weren't just what we know today. I mean, there were 14 to 16 foot sturgeon out there in that water. And I have gone kayaking over to that island, and I know my kayak is 9 feet long. There was a sturgeon paddling back to the landing, and that jumped and they belly flopped down, and it rocked my kayak. It was so close, and I paddled so fast you could see a rooster tail behind my kayak, I swear.
In 1995, Swan Island was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Today, the island attracts 3,000 to 4,000 visitors each year and continues to function as a wildlife sanctuary for migrating waterfowl, turkeys, bald eagles, and deer. For today's casual visitor, Swan Island offers miles of pleasant hiking and exploring opportunities. Kayaking and canoeing are also popular here, but be forewarned, paddling this stretch of the Kennebec takes stamina. The river here is tidal, and if you don't time your trip carefully, you'll find yourself struggling upstream against strong winds and surging currents at various points throughout your journey. For safety reasons, visitors are advised to be on guard for ticks. Swan Island is primarily a wildlife preserve, and precautions are necessary. The old Perkins Highway, as it is known, remains the main transportation corridor of the island. The beaver pond, a traditional corn crib, and the wildlife viewing tower are just a few of the island's more popular tourist attractions found along the highway. And fishing is allowed on the island's largest pond. Today, nature has reclaimed much of what was once a thriving village, but mysterious reminders of a bygone era can still be seen all over the island. The quiet stillness of the island's landscape carries faint whispers of another time and place, an island village lost to the ages. Swan Island is open from May 15th until mid-October. Visitors can access Swan Island by ferry from Richmond. The ride from the town of Richmond Landing takes less than 10 minutes. Swan Island is the only wildlife management area in the state of Maine that allows for camping. 10 Adirondack-type shelters are available for overnight use, and clean, safe drinking water and modern bathroom facilities are also available. Hundreds of school groups have visited the island over the years, and the boathouse serves as a classroom for visitors young and old. In the 1950s and 60s, Terry Blen Parker's grandparents, Parker and Marion Blen, served as caretakers on the island. In her younger years, Terry struggled with serious health problems, and the island was a healing place where she was loved, cared for, and nurtured.
I had a rare bone disease that was similar to polio as a child, and I was diagnosed at 4 as being terminal by age 10. Sometimes I would lay on a blanket out there and read, and deer would come up to me. And so I thought that was pretty special, and I felt like I was in a magical place. I mean, how many kids do you know that have a deer for a pet? There would be days I would go out and read, sometimes under the pine tree out back of the house, or I'd go read in the field or something. Always animals would come up to me within a half hour. And I think it's just because the scent was familiar to them. I lived there, I rarely left, and I played outside a lot. So I must have had the scent of the fields and the trees and the pine needles, because they didn't seem too shy at all. Oh my goodness, raccoons. I had a pet raccoon. I was immersed in that natural environment and so ill that I just sucked in all the goodness I could get. And I think that's what healed me, that and my grandparents' love and patience. I'm beyond age 10 and here I am. That's pretty magical. So that is my magical island.
I refer to myself as a place-based historian. I actually was an English and Environmental Studies major at Bowdoin, Bowdoin's first Environmental Studies major. But when I got out, I got really involved with doing family history. And I've been doing that my own and for clients for many years since then. But I came to realize that if you take a physical place, an island, a building, a town, and look at it chronologically through time, then you see real people doing real things. And you can really picture how life was for those people. Swan Island is one of those places that I go out on, and I have a particularly strong sense of place. What is that based in? Historical association, energy coming from the earth itself, I can't tell you. But it's always been a place when I'm out there, there's no place I'd rather be. And again, I can't explain that.
No one really knows what tomorrow has in mind for this historic and much-loved island.
There are some really severe restrictions on what can go on in the island. So the challenge is to come up with the money to put the buildings in use. The big plan was to take the Gardner Dumeric Salt Box, which is at the campground where a lot of the programming is, and make that into a visitor center to be able to tell some of the stories of the island and of the environment. In terms of the state ever doing away with it, I don't see it happening. Now, it is possible the state could shut down tending it. They could shut down the campground. They could stop doing wildlife management on the island. But could they sell it? No, I don't see that ever changing. It will always be a wildlife management area.
When you visit Swan Island, you're on sacred ground. Take to the woods, waters, and trails found here and explore the wonders of this culturally and historically significant place. And never forget the island's centuries-old history. Your visit honors generations of gritty, hardworking islanders that once gave it their all to survive here. Hardy, resilient souls dedicated to creating a life for themselves and their families on this most uniquely beautiful and peaceful island on the Kennebec River. You can let your imagination roam free here. Who were these islanders? What kind of challenges did they face in their daily lives? All of the joys, struggles, and hardships of their island years are forever lost in the mists of time. As you explore this sacred place, observe your surroundings closely. Pause and take a moment to look at the sky. Soaring high above the ancient pines and the wide-open fields, you may very well see reminders of a cherished place Native Americans once knew as Sawangan, the legendary Island of Eagles.